Good morning, everyone. Are you ready for day 3 of Change Now? Welcome to our Youth Parliament Generation Democracy. My name is Agata Meissner. I'm a co-founder of Generation Climate Europe and a climate justice strategist. The Youth Parliament is a very special format at Change Now. It's a half-a-day program that has been specifically co-designed for all of you with a group of young people coming from nonprofits, startups, social enterprises, and grassroots. And we won't stop with just a session. We'll capture all of your ideas and contributions into a Youth Parliament publication and a Democracy Toolbox after Change Now. That means we have an interactive and exciting session ahead of us. Today, you'll be guided by 3 moderators. Myself, Jadi Fonseca, who's an inspiring poet and a narrative weaver, and Mohamed El Amir, who's an incredible ocean activist and a biomaterial entrepreneur. In this year's Youth Parliament, we're focusing on democracy. So to begin, let's start with a little exercise. I invite you to picture this world. A head of state of the world's largest economy is unlawfully attacking other countries because he believes his own mind is more important than international law. The world's richest person is allowed to spend his fortune to steer the elections in Europe's largest country, supporting an extremist political group. And social media algorithms are prioritizing polarized far-right content, reinforcing a narrow worldview, which leads people to hate rather than to understand each other. Citizens' private movements are tracked, allowing governments and the tech giants to collect information on where they are, what they do, and what they buy. At first glance, this might sound like a plot of a new dystopian Netflix show, or maybe a political version of cyberpunk. But this is our reality today. And yet, this is only part of the picture. And you'll buy into this version of reality if you limit yourself to scrolling social media, talking with people with the same worldview, because, it's comfortable and safe and reassuring, or reading the oh-so-dramatic headlines that we see everywhere. But if you do, you'll miss out on the more hopeful stories, like the one where citizens across Europe pushed the My Voice, My Choice campaign past 1 million signatures, forcing the European Commission to respond to demands for safe and accessible abortion. Or the one in Bangladesh, where Gen Z protests led to what is now widely cited as the first successful Gen Z revolution in the world that inspired other Gen Z activists in other Asian countries. Or the one in Taiwan, where citizens and governments work together through digital platforms like V-Taiwan to deliberate on complex issues and directly shape legislation. The truth is that, yes, democracy is under attack, but it's also being reimagined and fought for before our own eyes. So let us dive a little deeper into what democracy is, how to protect it, how to rebuild it, and what are some of the myths around democracy. I'm delighted to welcome on stage Ziad Majed, who is a political scientist, a professor, and Middle East Studies program coordinator at the American University of Paris. Ziad has written books on Lebanon, on Syria, on Palestine, and on regional politics and transitions in Arab countries. So let's give him a big round of applause. Ziad, you spent years analyzing democratic movements, particularly in contexts where democracy is contested, fragile, or actively suppressed. So I just wanted to start with the first key question, because this is Generation Democracy. What do we actually mean when we say democracy?
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. To talk about democracy, I think most of you know what are the basic aspects of its definition. But let's say that in addition to the fact that democracy is about the right of people to choose their own representatives in managing the public and the common affairs through elections and through free and fair elections, which by itself is a big challenge, democracy is also about the separation of power, not to allow anyone to concentrate powers in the hands of a few. It is about the independence of the judiciary, so that accountability, so that transparency could always be a basis for judgment and for being involved or being connected to the public affairs. It is about the expression and the freedom of expression, about the media, about diversity, about social conducts that are based on tolerance, on accepting differences. That's why elections exist. So democracy is a series of philosophical principles, legislations, laws, practices that should sustain and protect a political system in which people have a voice, in which they can vote, they can follow up on what is happening in the public sphere, they can ask their representatives questions, they can look into the way they vote in the parliament to see what kind of legislations they support. They should have the right to form political parties, to join civil society organizations, to be part of unions. But democracy is not only that, of course. During the Cold War, for instance, and because of the fear of the Soviet Union, many democratic countries tried to bring in lots of notions related to social justice, related to dealing with economic disparities. When it comes to international relations, democracy was supposed as well to create an international system where countries do have, we cannot say equal voices, but at least equal presence in international organizations. The idea of having an international law and an international humanitarian law was also to put regulations when conflicts erupt, to avoid conflicts when that is possible, to have a United Nations system in which all voices can be heard, in which discussions, deliberations can take place. But unfortunately, with time, first when it comes to international relations and when it comes to the United Nations system, we do see more and more tendencies for the powerful nations to impose their will and to impose their interests on the rest of the humanity, regardless of democratic principles, regardless of universalism, and regardless of international law. We can see it in wars, we can see it in violations of international law that remain in total impunity. We can see it in the way the veto right is being used on the international scene. The veto right was put in place to secure a kind of peaceful arrangements, to avoid confrontations between nuclear nations. Today, the veto right is being used to protect allies of the powerful nations, even when they commit crimes against humanity, even when they commit war crimes. So on the international level, there is a big issue when it comes to democracy. And on the national level, there are still lots of reflections, analysis, organizations that try to observe, to monitor elections, to try to bring in ideas for reforms so that democracy would not stagnate within a certain set of principles and practices that can be threatened from time to time. As you said, they are vulnerable. So there is always work also in democracy. It's not a system that should not evolve. The challenge, in fact, is how to develop it, to make it a mirror of the needs of a society and of the way it can represent itself in the best way possible.
Thank you. Democracy has been, I would say, very much at the center of a lot of discussions, particularly in the last few years. But I think in many cases, it has been dominated by that Western perspective. So I think it's one of those misconceptions that people might have about what democracy actually is. I'm wondering, what are some of the other ones that you've seen in your work, some of the common myths, perhaps, about what democracy is and how it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of misconceptions when it comes to democracy. One of them is that there are only some people or some societies in the world where democracy is possible, or where the individuals and the collectivities deserve democracy. We can hear it sometimes in the media, in political discourses, in different narratives, that some parts of the world, since you mentioned that I'm originally from the Middle East, from Lebanon, we hear today lots of people saying, but democracy cannot work in these societies because their culture is not compatible with democratic practices. This is definitely a culturalistic approach. This is almost a racist approach, because democracy is supposedly universal. It's true that it started in countries where, after a certain capitalistic accumulation, where a certain trajectory in history brought democracy as a political system to manage and to govern territories and populations. And we're talking obviously about some Western nations. But democracy is universal, and there are lots of non-Western nations where democracy is functioning and is meeting challenges, of course, but is still the mode of life of people and society. While democracy itself is being threatened in many Western countries, from the United States of America with the series of Donald Trump violations of many democratic contracts, to countries in Europe where the far right is a real challenge to democracy, where you do have concentration as well, and economic disparities are leading to more and more challenges when it comes to democracy. Plus, there is another misconception, considering that whenever we have democracy, then all problems can be dealt with easily, or that if we are a democratic nation, it means we do not commit violations of international law. This is definitely wrong. Most violations of international law today, severe violation when it comes to armed conflicts, are committed by many cases by very powerful nations that have a democratic history and a long democratic tradition and a series of practices that supposedly are democratic, and in the roots of their political culture, democracy was there. So you can be in a democratic nation and, due to the balance of power, due to impunity, still violate international law, and this is something extremely serious to address. Then another misconception is related to the fact that many believe that as long as we have democracy, we should not keep thinking of developing our political systems. While with time, it appeared that democracy can be challenged by non-democratic forces within the democratic arena itself. They can use elections to reach power and then try to violate series of laws, try to modify series of legislations. So democracy should always be reconsidered as a path, as a system that should regularly evolve. It needs regularly as well reforms. It needs to respond to new challenges. Now we see the ecologic challenge, the climate change challenge, that requires lots of reconsidering many democratic practices. With time and with more and more feminist movements imposing the discourse, challenging patriarchal structure, because we can be in a democracy but having a very strong patriarchal structure discriminating against women. So this is now a real challenge, how to rethink politics with a different approach. We did have democracies in which racism was also implemented through discriminating against part of the population, whether because of their skin color, or because of their ethnicity, or because of their language. We can see it today. Yesterday, for example, in Israel, the parliament did vote a law in which the death penalty can only and exclusively be applied to Palestinian prisoners accused of terrorism. It cannot apply to non-Palestinian meaning to other Israeli citizens in the state of Israel. I'm not talking about the occupied territories of 1967. While we keep saying that this is a democracy, however, its law that is exclusively about one specific group is definitely not a democratic practice. The same thing was in South Africa for a long period of time, where you did have democracy for white people and white settlers, while the black population in South Africa, the overwhelming majority of the South Africans, were deprived and did not have the same rights and the same access. The same for the United States in a certain period of time. And today, more and more, there are threats on democracy by rising authoritarian regimes, even if they were elected. We can see it in Europe, we can see it in India, we can see it in many places. I'm excluding the Middle East because, unfortunately, we are struggling as societies to bring in democracy or to protect what already exists in forms of freedoms of expression, but we're not yet democratic nations or states with a democratic experience.
You touched upon something very interesting, which is that hypocrisy of what does it actually mean to be democratic at home and democratic abroad, and how can we actually consistently fight for democracy? Because what very often happens, and we've seen this with Palestine, but also with many, many other situations, is that a country, as you said, considered democratic, does so internally, but that when it comes to what's happening abroad, it's a whole other story. And it's a big hypocrisy of then calling other countries undemocratic, where in fact the processes in the country itself are problematic themselves. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about alternatives, because there have been more and more people recently calling for alternatives to democracy, calling for a new system, saying, listen, the system doesn't work anymore, it doesn't respond to the needs that we have right now, we need to push for something new, we need to push for something better. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, okay, so what are these alternatives? I mean, how could this actually look like? How could the system better, different than democracy actually function?
Well, thank you for this question, because I think this is extremely important to address at the same time the democratic challenges nationally and internationally. It's becoming more and more impossible to disconnect them and to consider that we can live in isolated islands as long as things are okay in our own society. We don't care about what's happening elsewhere. This is becoming more and more impossible because of globalization, because of media, because of people traveling, because of mobility, because of a new generation that is not satisfied with this kind of argument, that is reading, discovering, traveling. So this is very important to deal with. Well, for the national level first, I think that we have been used to deal with representative democracy. While there are other forms today of democracy that can be related as well to deliberative democracy, to participative democracy, meaning I do not only vote and then I wait 4 more years or 2 more years or 5 more years to vote again. I need to be in between, engaged, committed. I can join social movements, I can join unions, I can join political parties. I need to see what kind of laws and regulations and legislations are being voted. I need to have a say. We can start at the university level, even at the school level, in terms of dealing with challenges on campus or when it comes to our student life. It can follow us everywhere. There is a democratic culture that should be once again encouraged and should encourage people to be interested in different questions. There should be as well policies related to the economic disparities, because it's becoming more and more difficult to have billionaires who are in politics, who own media, who can have influence on public opinion, who can accumulate money in a pervert way, I mean in an incredible way, while you do have as well in democratic nations themselves people who are totally marginalized and forgotten. So automatically there is no equality between them when it comes to political representation, to political influence, and there is a need for more laws and regulations and legislations related to the question of social justice, bringing it back to the center of democracy, not only as a response to the Soviet Union threat as it used to be a few decades ago, but as a threat to the monopoly of power, of influence inside the society. So more participation, more freedoms, defending what exists, asking for more, observing, participating in campaigns, signing petitions, reading about what's happening everywhere. All of those could, let's say, support democracy and making it as well and make it more participative and not only representative or based on elections. At the same time, since we said we cannot disconnect what is happening locally with internationally, what's happening elsewhere, there is a huge interest today and even a necessity, a vital necessity, to look at what's happening around us. We live at a moment where more and more racist discourses are being tolerated, where more and more wars and terrible violence are targeting societies with total impunity because of the powerful actors who are involved. International law is becoming an opinion, not a principle that should manage our all international relations. The powerful nations do consider that whatever they decide should be accepted without the principle of democracy in international relations. So maybe if we start in Europe, the idea of a European Union that is more responsible, more independent in dealing with international affairs, more concerned with international law, more concerned with international mechanisms, could be a start because the EU is losing its weight, is losing its role, and at a moment where there is a war in Eastern Europe with the Russian war on Ukraine, when the United States do allow themselves to intervene everywhere, and now the war in Iran, regardless of what we think of the Iranian regime itself, that is very brutal, but war was a violation of international law. When we see what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, when we see what's happening in Lebanon, when we talk about occupation and illegal colonization with all the crimes against humanity going with, and we see that either it's silence or complicity, we have to ask lots of questions about our responsibilities as citizens, at least on our level, how to be more vocal, how to read more, to share more information, to encourage colleagues and other friends to be interested, to talk to our representatives on the municipal level, on the parliamentary level, wherever we can, to be present as citizens, because this is a responsibility. It's a duty and a responsibility not to accept that internationally impunity dominates, that we can tolerate and live with a genocide or with a violation or with a war for reasons that are not legal and justified. And on the local level, how to always be on the national level ready to defend what democracy brought as privileges and as guarantees for our life together, and to be ready as well to think of developing it, of finding alternative. Some of them are not ready elaborated, but they can be with common work and with these kind of events and the work of think tanks and of interested politicians.
So yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. I think what it makes me realize is that democracy is actually continuously constructed and reconstructed. And that begins with the stories that we tell. So that's exactly where we're going to go next. I will hand over to Jari Fonseca, who will take us on a collective storytelling journey to use the power of imagination and imagine what democracy actually could look like if we truly allowed ourselves to imagine it. Thank you so much.